Thank you very much, NASA. Very much appreciate the opportunity to come and share some points with you. Good morning, His Excellencies and distinguished guests. I've had a very difficult group to follow here, I think, given that they made very, very important points, and so I'm going to adjust my presentation to try to emphasize certain aspects that they've already brought up. There are four key trends, and some of them have already been talked about: the rise of developing countries and economic convergence, the increased developing country participation in global value chains, and trade growth in relation to overall growth. I think some of the presentations have talked about economic growth, and my slide doesn't seem to be coming out here, but okay, here it is. You'll see that over the last decades, there's been faster GDP growth in developing countries, which has allowed pretty significant economic convergence. So despite many of the challenges that have been observed in terms of financial crisis, geopolitical tensions, tensions at the WTO over negotiations and the scope of the negotiations, we actually see that there's been significant economic convergence, and trade has played a very important part of this economic convergence. And that goes well beyond the emerging markets. We also see that least developed countries have had a very significant positive effect as a result of engaging in the global economy. So the role of trade in economic growth, and this is something Tony wrote a very interesting paper on. It's been a challenging question for economists to try to answer the question. We see a lot of correlation, but it's very difficult to tease out the effect of increased trade versus or improved trade policies compared to other domestic reforms and behind-the-border policies. But you see here from this graph that there's very high correlation between trade and growth. And this probably gets at Xavier's point about exchange of goods and ideas. You can see also that there's been very significant growth in developing countries' participation in intermediates and final goods exports. And I also want to emphasize the importance of services. The light blue bars at the bottom here reflect the increasing share of services trade embedded in goods trade, goods, manufactured goods, and commodities. And the little diamond shapes represent the amount of services embedded in 1995, and you can see that in almost all cases, the light blue bar at the bottom now far exceeds where the green diamond was in 1995. It's very important to realize that many of these services that are embedded in value in manufactured goods are non-tradable services. So these are things, activities that happen within a country that typically aren't exchanged directly with another country, but actually end up embedded in the value of the goods that you export. And this is an extraordinarily important economic phenomenon to realize that you are able to exchange or to share with other countries capabilities that typically are not exchanged across borders, embedded in the value of other goods. So what are some of the remaining challenges? And this is, I want to bring up a couple of points I don't think have been touched upon this morning. And that's the notion that there's a domestic value chain in addition to a global value chain. So when you look at countries that have been very successful in global value chains, the very early movers were Europe and the United States, which had already gone through a period of domestic outsourcing or fragmentation of their domestic production policies. Or their domestic production processes. They then, through international agreements, the WTO and other international agreements, and foreign direct investment, were able to offshore parts of these production processes. However, they wouldn't have offshored if they hadn't already had experienced and developed capabilities to fragment their domestic production process. In order for that domestic fragmentation to occur, they needed to have an ecosystem of capabilities of other companies, sometimes small and medium-sized enterprises, sometimes other multinationals who could provide goods and services for them to break up their supply chain. And now they're able to do this internationally. What we observe, and we're trying to measure better, for developing countries to engage in the global value chain, it's often very important for them to also develop this domestic value chain, okay? Develop an ecosystem of capabilities which would then extend far beyond just what they export, but would also provide significant cost benefits, quality increases, timely delivery to the entire domestic economy. And one of the things that I observe with things like free zones is often these are clusters of capabilities coming together, sometimes focused at the external market, sometimes focused at the internal market, but it's a great opportunity to experiment and think about what works and what then might be able to move to broader application across the economy. This is a graph that shows some of the remaining challenges. Tariffs have come down significantly. Most of the remaining challenges in terms of global trade costs relate to things that are behind the border. So it isn't just a matter of the cost of exchanging goods from one country to another, but what happens when they get to the border. Again, this is another place where I think free zones focus. These areas are often areas that are not well established at the WTO. They're often dealt with in the regional trade agreements, and the mega regionals are very focused on this, what we like to call WTO plus, often taking WTO disciplines and making them deeper, sometimes going into areas where the WTO has not yet reached a multilateral agreement. And this is really the most difficult and the most challenging area, I think, that the global economy is going to face. And it's very enheartening for me to come here and see these kinds of issues being addressed in the context of free zones. And I think Dr. Al-Zaruni mentioned a number of these areas that, demonstrated that often what companies are interested in is not having to deal with challenges, but having somebody provide low-cost solution to those challenges. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.